Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Thursday afternoon Critical Canadian Building Science series sponsored by Enbridge. I feel like we need some music, maybe some theme music for these sessions. We'll give folks a few more seconds to set up in front of Zoom. Good afternoon, Zoran. Good to have you back. David McCauley and a number of other folks there. So yeah, we are really lucky, very fortunate to have Trevor Trainor back with us this afternoon. So folks, welcome to the part 10 of our Critical Canadian Building Science series. This one we're taking a little bit of a left turn. We're going to move into historical homes and deep energy retrofits. Someone called them net zero renos, call them what you want, deep energy retrofits, deep greening, all sorts of things. But there are challenges with this. We often say, if you can do a deep energy net zero renovation, then you can do a deep energy net zero new any day of the week. Just because the building science challenges are so substantial. And so we have Trevor here with us today. The sponsor for this afternoon, again, as has been this last year, is Enbridge. And we do appreciate the support that Enbridge does bring to our home building industry, not only through sponsorships of programs like this, but also through almost 15 years of integrated design training and planning through the Savings by Design program. So Trevor, good to have you this afternoon. You say hello or introduce yourself.
Yeah, no, it's always great to be here. I enjoy getting into the geekery that is building science with you guys, and so it's fun. I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah, good to have you. We was just sharing with Trevor. We had Trevor took us through the Great Canadian Vapor Barrier Challenge there a month or so ago, and it has led to some very interesting discussions, even some at, say, the code level here in Canada, where, hold on a minute, maybe it is time for us to reinvigorate changing the wording in our building code. So, little sessions like this can go a long way, helps us rethink, helps us remember the things that we used to know. Trevor, I think you've said too, and I've heard, John Straub and others like yourself say, we have to sometimes go back and get the information from these things called books, not just stuff you can pull off Wikipedia, right?
Yeah, that's also Stiebrick's listen to the old guys.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Old guys and old gals. It was interesting. I was listening to one on Florence Nightingale, right? Of all the individuals, her work on, virus spread and humidity related to all the influenza, things like that is really interesting. Cool. So yeah, I'm your host, Andy, Building Knowledge Canada. We'll move into this quickly. This is Trevor's Hour. Real quick, folks, I do the intro. I'm going to do a little bit of just about 2-minute context setting, why this is important to our industry, particularly in Canada, North America. And then Trevor's going to take us down the deep path of, what do we need to be doing? What do we need to be considering? And just to note, Trevor, you do a lot of work, Bawating Building Science, yourself and partners. You do a lot of work on historical retrofits, hydrothermal detailing, modeling, things like that. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Over the years, on the lab side, have done a lot of testing of bricks, stones, historic materials from lots of buildings, some of which are quite famous, and some of which are just downtown Toronto warehouse building that's being converted to a condo building.
Interesting. I think it was some of your work that you did. I remember listening to a session or reading an article maybe about you were looking at even the differences in clay brick.
Yeah, we'll talk a bit about that today. Yeah. Interesting. Old brick is not one thing. It's a lot of different things. Yeah.
Cool. So, folks, just a reminder, housekeeping, if you have questions that are topical, please put them in the Q&A because we're going to try to make a chance for Trevor to answer some questions. And if we don't get to all of them, We'll make sure that we follow up with some written answers for you with Trevor's help. Be kind, be thoughtful, be considerate of each other. We're not, hopefully we're not here to advertise projects, so be thoughtful in the chat, be respectful of each other. Stacy is in the background as the Building Knowledge Canada webinar, so if you're having technical issues with Zoom, please contact her, or you need additional links to information or things like that, you can ask her. You are going to get a survey. Please fill it out. The surveys mean a lot to us because it helps us, it helps Enbridge, it helps our supporters understand how important it is and what these mean to you so that we can keep going. Good news is, by the way, 2023, we're moving ahead. So you can expect Thursday afternoons, well into 2023. I think we'll move right through the year with the same thing. And hopefully we'll make Trevor a regular occurrence as well too. Closed captioning is available, bottom of your screen. Check the closed captioning box under the live transcript. You will receive a copy of the presentation along with a link to the recording. And all of these sessions, whether it's today or even the past 2 years, do sit on our website under resources. You can go and listen to them, share them with your team, have building science coffee breaks and listen to some building science as a team. So just notionally, a couple of things I think we understand is, green your homes are great, right? We have this national program about greening homes, and some would argue that it's sort of limited to a heat pump swap program. And often that's what incentive programs are, is they're very much have tunnel vision on what they're trying to achieve. But we are really starting to understand, and I think even at the federal level, that it's a lot more than that, that we have to go farther than just simple mechanical changes. And we have to be careful because we got to understand it's not just about fuel switching. We've got other issues around carbon we need to be comparative. So we need to move farther and we need to move smarter as we move ahead. Couple reminders of these unintended consequences, right? Yeah, we're famous, in cold climates for doing stupid stuff in the name of energy efficiency or otherwise that ends up destroying the structure. We have to be really careful with that. And Trevor's going to talk to that. We know what it means to try to make things tight and insulated, and we end up with humidity that is out of control. We end up with surface condensation. We end up as well with mechanical systems that no longer work after we do the enclosure. Or worse yet, what we're seeing with some of these deep green energy is we do all these things to the envelope, and then what do we do about right sizing appropriate mechanicals? That's another topic for another day, Trevor. I think it's maybe part 2. The other one too is, we've got to be careful. We still have to be able to operate these homes within an efficiency and an affordability range for the occupants that live there. And then the other one, I know Trevor and I were just talking briefly, this is one we've got to keep a little bit of an eye on. It's sort of been in our peripheral vision for a few years, but I think we've got to bring it to the front is, what about this embodied carbon deal? If we're going to decrease operational emissions by deep energy or lower energy, we have to be careful that maybe some of the materials we're using don't have an embodied carbon content that totally negates or actually makes worse that scenario. So I don't want to rabbit trail on that today, and I don't think that's really where we're going today. We're just going to hit to the building science, but these are some of the things that Trevor is going to help us with, not just today, but in the future as we go down this path. I do want to give a shout out to the Net Zero Home Program. This is a brand new home labeling program released 4 or 5 years ago. There's some context here. This is a labeling program. It's actually recognized by large stakeholders in the industry. City of Toronto, Saskatoon, Vancouver, a number of municipalities in Canada are actually offering additional funding for deep energy retrofit specifically that have this label on them. So there's a link, have a look at it. And the other thing too is resources, right? Where do you start with some of this stuff? And I know a number of you on here, like I can imagine, David McCauley's on here. I can imagine what David's library looks like in his office. I would love to get into that and to see what it is. But for those of us sort of at the start, here's a couple interesting references that can sort of help put our toe in the door and when it comes to retrofitting or renovation for energy efficiency. So Trevor, I'm going to drop my screen off and take it away, sir.
Great. Thank you very much.
Andy, really quickly, did you want to do some polls for the people today?
Oh,
I forgot the polls. Sure. Yes. Go ahead, bring up your screen, Trevor. That's all right. And we can run the polls over top. Oh, yeah, that's right. Thanks, Stacy. Yeah, so folks, again, thanks, Stacy, for reminding me about that. Where are you from? Well, looks like we've made it across Canada again. Look at that. Very cool. Well, we've got coast to coast. We've got some Atlantic. We've got some British Columbia. Got a lot of folks in Ontario, some Manitoba, Alberta, Quebec. Very cool. It's very good to have all of you with us. And obviously, if you don't fit in any of these boxes, feel free to throw it in the chat. Yeah, thanks, Stacy. And that's very, very informative. And real quick, occupation. Very good. Architects, engineers, builder, renovators, developers, still at the lead there. The practical application of all this stuff, right? Someone's got to do it. Energy advisors, consultants, building officials. Very nice. College prof, Patrick Langevin from the federal government. Good to have you, Patrick. Again, doing some phenomenal work there with the LEAD program. Excellent. Thank you, folks. That's very nice to see that. And looks like some folks as well from even outside and other professions. So take a look at the chat with some of those. And there you go, Trevor.
Awesome. There we go. Well, thanks a lot, Andy, and thanks to BK for inviting me here today. This is a presentation that I've wanted to take the time to put together for quite a while now. And this really gave me the opportunity to dig in and get this presentation put together. This is the first time I've ever given this presentation, so a little caveat is I don't know exactly how long it is, so we'll figure it out as we go, I guess.
Awesome.
There we go. So Andy alluded to this a little bit, but why save old buildings at all? Like, why not just tear them down and build new ones? Lots of reasons, right? And the one that I really gravitate to personally is preserving the character and history of our old neighborhoods and our communities, because I love walking around my community and looking at the old houses, and you know, there's so many different designs and styles. It's really, to me, gives me you know, I enjoy that a lot. Obviously, we're going to, compared to tearing a building down and starting over, we're going to save some money and time for sure. Those are big ones. We're going to reduce waste. So instead of tearing that building down and figuring out how to get rid of it, we're going to reuse as many of those materials as we can. And then the big one that Andy was talking about was really reducing our carbon footprint. So currently buildings overall are responsible for about 40% of our global carbon emissions. You know, that includes the operational carbon and the embodied carbon. And for a new construction building, we would expect that embodied carbon would be about 50% of its carbon emissions, operations the other 50 over its lifespan. So if we can get rid or really reduce that embodied carbon part, while also improving our operational carbon by making it a more efficient building, I think we have a really good place to start. It's been said that the greenest building is the one that's already built. And that is true to some extent. There are, obviously, it's more complicated than that. It depends on what kind of a timeline you're looking at. Depends on what materials you use in that new building, how carbon intensive they are, and what energy levels each of those can get to. So I think there's definitely a lot of reasons to save our old buildings, but it is more complicated than it's always good. It's always better to save our old buildings than to rebuild new. There's a lot that goes into it, and you know, over the next few years, that's going to be a bigger and bigger part of our industry, is understanding our carbon emissions, both embodied and operational. Well, why don't we just leave those old buildings alone then? Why don't we just keep using them as they are? A lot of reasons for that too, right? Building code related issues, you know, what about access to these buildings? Is it appropriate for our current codes? Obviously, electrical and plumbing and all those things need to be upgraded for safety. Also, energy use and cost, right? That's the big one. Especially these big older homes that look beautiful, they can cost a lot of money to operate, to keep them warm in the winter. The colder the climate, the more extreme this is. And comfort issues, right? nobody wants to live anymore in a house that has a cold corner or a cold room, or that has a breeze over by the kitchen or the living room. So these are all things that we as a society, come to expect is comfort in our homes. And a lot of times these old homes as built aren't providing that, and we need to work with them to improve them, make them better. So before we get into how we're going to do it, I think we need to just step back a little bit and talk about some building science fundamentals, which is always my favorite part of the presentation anyway. So let's talk about the building enclosure. When I talk about the building enclosure, I usually try not to use the word envelope, just because I think enclosure is a better term to really describe what these parts of the building are doing. So the building enclosure are those parts of the building that separate indoors from outdoors: the roof, the walls, windows and doors, the foundation, those kind of things. And it's made up of two sort of distinct portions. One is the structure, what holds the building up. And the second is the functional layers. When we talk about functional layers, we like to talk about and think about buildings not by like what the layers are called, what material is used, if it's Tyvek or if it's plywood or whatever. We like to talk about what the function of those layers is. And four of the main functions we need to think about all the time are water control. So what's controlling water inside to outside? Air control, thermal control, and vapor control. And those are listed really in their order of importance too, right? There's no use in adding a bunch of insulation to our buildings if they're air leaky and they leak water, right? So we need to make sure water control is taken care of before we worry about how airtight our building is. And we need to worry about how airtight our building is before we worry about how much insulation is in the walls or the roof. So that's always important to think about as we go through. Now, when we talk about modern buildings, a lot of times the structure is a separate thing than the functional layers, right? So usually the structure for houses is a wood frame, but we could have concrete block, steel, CLT, lots of things could be the structure. And the functional layers are often separate layers, right? So, whether the water control layer is house wrap and our air control is poly on the inside, that's our typical approach. Thermal control is obviously the insulation, but if we're using full cell spray foam, maybe that insulation is also the air control and water control. So we need to define those and think about those. And they're often in our modern buildings, different layers, and they need to come together differently depending on which ones we choose. But when we're talking about old school buildings, we're talking about structural brick, triple wide brick is sort of the main sort of prototype that I'll be talking about today. Really, every function in that wall system is taken by the bricks and mortar. So the structure is bricks and mortar, and the functional layers are too, right? Water control, that's bricks and mortar. Air control, thermal control, and vapor control, all taken by the same material there, the brick and the mortar. One of the issues and why we need to work on our buildings and improve them is because bricks and mortar aren't very good at any of those. They're definitely not very good at water control. Historically, builders in an area would just keep making the brick walls thicker and thicker until they didn't leak anymore. Air control, we know old brick buildings are quite air leaky, and there's always cracks and ways for air to get through. So it acted in that function, it just wasn't very good at it. Same with thermal control, right? There's a certain thermal mass and a certain resistance to a thick brick wall, but it's not up to our current standards. And that's what we one of the reasons why we want to improve these. So as we're talking about, just generally about all these control layers, we want to know and think about what's the function of each layer as we're adding them. And as we're adding things to our old brick walls, we want to think about what's the function? Why am I adding it? What is it supposed to do? We also want to think about what's the level of performance that we expect of it. If we're trying to meet a passive house air tightness, we're going to choose different materials than if we're just trying to meet code or get to 3 air changes per hour at 50. We're going to take a different approach, and you probably use different materials. We also need to think about how those layers interact with each other. Are we creating a vapor trap somewhere in there because the inner layer and the outer layer are both vapor closed? And how do those layers transition? How does the air barrier from the wall meet the air barrier of the roof and the air barrier of the foundation? How do these things transition? And also, what about things that poke through? What about penetrations, especially the biggest and ugliest of our penetrations, windows and doors? Obviously not visually ugly, but from a building science perspective, most challenging penetrations, windows and doors. And as we think about all of these layers, we need to always remember that continuity of each of these layers is key to success, the key to performance. And to get that continuity, it's all about detailing. We need to figure out and draw out all these details and make sure that we're getting the continuity we want. And that when the builder goes to build it, he has a roadmap to make this building work the way it should. So the first thing we're going to talk about is sort of our original brick wall and how heat flow through it worked. So before we add anything to it, let's just think about how it is right now. Triple wide brick wall, right? So we know the thermal conductivity in brick and mortar, which gives us overall about an R value of 0.36 per inch. So for a triple wide brick, we've got about R4 worth of brick in there. So that's almost a 12-inch thick wall, and it's R4, right? So that's probably not even as good as our windows if we're using decent windows. And when we're talking about old brick walls and we're talking about such low R values, we start to even include and think about the air film coefficients on the inside and outside. So these thin layers of air that actually give some thermal performance to our walls. In a normal insulated wall, it's so minor we often ignore it. But when we talk about a wall that's only R4, these air films start to become important. So an interior air film has an R value of about R1.1 and an exterior air film of about 0.9. So together, the two of them, probably about R2 of thermal performance compared to R4 of the entire brick wall. So they start to become a little bit more important. And the reason why they're important is when we think about how the temperature changes across this brick wall as we go from inside to outside. So let's assume we have 20 degrees air inside the house and it's -10 outside. This is what the temperature profile across the wall will look like. So we actually get a bit of a jump. So our interior surface of our brick is actually only about 14 degrees. So it's a lot cooler than the air temperature. And the other thing that's important, and that we're going to talk more about, is that the exterior surface of our wall, when it's -10 outside, is probably more like -5 or -6. It's not as cold on the surface as the air temperature is outside because of that air film coefficient and the fact that we don't have a very well insulated wall to begin with. That's going to come into play in a little bit. The other thing we need to think about is what's the overall heat loss through this wall. And with the air films and the brick, we're at about 1.1 watts per meter squared Kelvin. And we'll talk about when we change the wall, why that matters. So that's how the heat flow through an old brick wall works. What about moisture flow through an old brick wall with no coatings on it? Nothing, we haven't done anything to it yet. This is how it works, right? Liquid water that hits the exterior face of that wall, whether it's through driving rain, roof runoff, window runoff, that kind of thing. A large portion of it actually gets absorbed into the brick through capillarity and is stored inside the brick until it has a chance to dry out. Only a smaller portion gets deflected or drained out, but a lot of it gets absorbed. Once the conditions have changed, it's not raining out anymore, it's drier out, then this brick can dry outward, right? There's a pretty powerful force that, especially if the sun hits it, we can get a lot of drying to the outside. If it's low humidity outside, this can happen quickly. We even have a pathway to dry interior to the interior if we need to in this wall. So there's a couple different ways we can dry this out. And water vapor will just move right through this wall. It doesn't get hung up anywhere. So we don't really have to worry about it too much. And we talked about monolithic walls a couple of weeks ago in our vapor barrier discussion. And when it comes to a monolithic wall like this, you don't really even need a vapor barrier because there's no difference in vapor permeability of any layers here. It just kind of slowly flows through. It doesn't accumulate anywhere. So it's never really a problem. So that's moisture flow in sort of the existing brick wall. And one of the things we have to worry about when it comes to brick and certain building stones also is freeze thaw damage. And so we're going to talk later about how when we change the brick wall, we may change its risk for freeze thaw damage. But let's understand what that is first. So the formation of frost and the expansion of liquid water within the pores of a stone or a brick can cause high internal forces inside the material. Freeze thaw damage is structural deterioration of these materials due to those forces. We're also known as spalling. Right, so it's the chipping or crumbling. Usually it happens at the exterior surface because that's usually the wettest and coldest part of it, but could happen anywhere. This is an example from literally a week ago of not an old building, about a 2-year-old building, where you can see they installed these concrete-based manufactured stones right on these concrete stairs. The wetness of the stairs combined with the salt content in the stairs have damaged these severely within a couple of years. It's a really big problem there. For freeze thaw damage to occur, we need 2 different conditions. So we need the material to be below freezing temperatures. So I'm not saying below 0, I'm saying below freezing temperatures. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the material must be sufficiently wet. It can't be a little wet, it has to be sufficiently wet. And again, we'll talk about why I'm using such vague terms in a second.
Good.
So how cold is cold enough? So actually, the moisture inside the pores of masonry material need to go quite a bit below 0 degrees Celsius before they freeze or form frost. That's because as the process occurs, pressure forms in the pores, which decreases the freezing point of water. Again, water is weird. That's a whole other presentation, but that's one of the things that makes it weird. So the freezing point of water within the pores of a brick or stone is actually more like -3 to -5 degrees Celsius.
Okay.
So it has to be a little colder than you'd think for this process to start. And then if we take into account what we talked about with the temperature profile across the brick and the fact that the exterior of that brick is warmer than the exterior air, you actually need exterior air temperatures of about -7 to -10 degrees before we start to get this freeze thaw process that we're worried about. But that's in an uninsulated masonry wall. And this is going to change, as we'll see, as we insulate these walls. That's what we're worried about, are these changes and unintended consequences that come with changes. So how wet is wet enough? Again, I'm going to be pretty vague on this one because some masonry materials and even some old brick can hold a lot more water than others safely and without seeing freeze thaw damage. It's really a function of the pore size and the pore distribution inside the material, and also the strength and flexibility of the material. So this is an area where I've done extensive amounts of testing on old brick and old stones. And what the main purpose of our testing was to find what is called the critical saturation value. And the critical saturation value is that moisture content at which damage will occur if it sees freezing temperatures. And clay bricks, the critical saturation level can range anywhere from 30 to 90% of its maximum saturation value. So there's a huge variation there from house to house. Even bricks that look very similar can act very differently. So let's just say we've had a brick that had a critical saturation value of 80%. That's pretty normal. That means if it is at 75% moisture content, it can go through an infinite number of freeze thaw cycles without any damage occurring. But as soon as it's at a level above 80, so if it's at 85% moisture content, even one freeze thaw cycle will start to damage that material. So, and then as more occur, the damage starts to become visible, right? The early sign, the early damage is not even visible. We can measure it in a certain way in a lab. But eventually, if you get multiple freeze thaw events when the moisture content is above this critical value, you start to get what we're seeing over here on the right. And sadly, this is a case of the, what do they say? The cobbler's children have no shoes. This is my house.
Good for you. That's where the best building science lessons come, is our own mistakes. No?
Yes. Well, this one wasn't my mistake because the person I bought my house from spray foamed the rim joist area from the basement, right, which there's the top of foundation. This is all rim joist area. So it's something I'm going to have to deal with in the near future, but it wasn't my decision to do that.
Right.
So, unfortunately, you can't, just by looking at a given brick, you can't tell how susceptible it is to freeze thaw damage. You either have to do this lab testing, like we talked about, which is pretty expensive. It doesn't make sense for your average homeowner, your average residential project. It does make sense for large, important buildings where the construction budgets are millions of dollars. It does make sense to do that. But for most residential projects, it doesn't make sense. So what we need to do is approximate and think about, the freeze thaw vulnerability of the brick by visually inspecting those areas of the home that are wettest and coldest in their natural state. So what are some of those? A couple of those vulnerable areas are near downspouts, especially if you have leaky downspouts. This is an example here where there's water that's constantly running over at the downspout here. It was wet, but the brick looked fine. That's a good sign for the brick. This should be fixed, but it's a good sign for the brick, right? Also chimneys, that's really common, right? I could walk around my neighborhood and take 30 pictures, 40 pictures like this.
Yeah.
Where the chimney's the first thing to go. It's most exposed to water. It's not getting heat through the building envelope, building enclosure. So it's more vulnerable, and it gives some indication of how vulnerable the rest of the bricks are. Buttresses, which aren't that common in houses, but in other buildings are vulnerable. This is a picture I took from a warehouse building from sort of the 70s, not far from my house. Bricks near grade often are getting wet from the soil or splashback. This is another example of, like, these are obviously wet and there's a lot of salt and all the mortar's starting to go, but the bricks are in pretty good shape. So that gives a pretty good indication that they're pretty resistant to freeze thaw. The other areas we could look at would be parapets. Houses don't usually have parapets, but if they do. And then also if they build garages or did some landscaping with the same brick as the house, these are getting wetter than areas of the house, and they're staying wetter longer and seeing more freezing temperatures. So if there's like a little fence area made out of the same brick and it's fine, then you're in good shape. A lot of times those are the ones that decay really quickly. And so this is one way you can at least get a general idea of how susceptible your bricks are to freeze thaw. And that may help inform you as to if you should insulate and how you should insulate your home. So now we're going to get into some more of the actual details, and assuming that we've decided we are going to insulate for all the good reasons that we've talked about, and assuming that our brick looks pretty good, it's not falling apart and crumbling at areas that are more exposed or colder. So we've decided it is a good idea to insulate. There's a couple different ways we can do that. And we're going to talk through a few of those and how that changes the dynamics of the wall. So here's our original wall with nothing done to it. We've already talked through that. Here's one approach we could take. Even if your bricks are crumbling and you're not really confident that they're going to be freeze thaw resistant, we could go with an exterior insulated approach. So if you're not worried about the historic look of the building, you just want it to last a lot longer and perform a lot better, here's one thing we can do is add insulation to the outside of the brick wall. And we'll talk about a couple different ways practically how to do that. But here's what it does to the temperature dynamic, right? So we've added R10, let's say, to the outside. We've cut the heat flow through the wall by about 2/3 from that. And we've dramatically changed the temperature profile through the wall. The most important part being right here, at the exterior of the brick, which used to be, you know, in the -6, -5 degree area when it's -10 out. It's now like above 10 degrees because we put the majority of our value outside of it. So now this brick is going to be warm and we don't have to worry about any more freeze thaw for this particular brick wall. But what happens if we put the insulation on the inside, like most people want to do, so that we can still see this historic brick look? When we add R10 to the inside, again, we've reduced the heat flow by about 2/3 the same way, but our temperature profile looks a lot different and it looks a little scarier. So now all of our temperature drop, a large portion of it occurs across the inside, which means our brick wall is a lot colder than it used to be. So the interior face used to be, you know, 15, 14 degrees. It's now below 0, even on the interior face. And out at the exterior face, it's even colder than it was before we added our insulation, because now the effect of the air films isn't nearly as important because so much of the temperature drop occurs here. So this same wall that used to see temperatures of, you know, -5 or 6 when it was -10 are going to see temperatures at like -9 or -8 at that, under those same conditions. So we've automatically, just by doing that, even dropped the temperature of the outside face of our wall, which is the most vulnerable area to freeze thaw. And so that's why we got to be careful. This may just be enough to push us over the edge.
Okay, that was my question. Yeah, because sometimes you see that everything may be fine, brick, maybe the mortar, maybe there's some signs of a little bit of damage, a little bit of freeze thawing, you know, but once you put the inside and change that temperature gradient or limit the amount of energy going to, you could push some of the brick over that point.
Yeah, exactly. That's usually what you see, is that there'll just be a random pattern of bricks that start to fail. And that's just the variability of the material being made, right? Especially old brick that was fired in like beehive kilns and stuff. It's not a consistent temperature. There's not a lot of quality control. And so they have different properties. And sometimes the worst ones start to fail first.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So that's what happens to the temperature dynamic of the wall. What happens to the moisture dynamic? So remember, we talked about our original wall and how it could dry in and dry out. If we add our exterior insulation to our wall, we've changed this very, you know, completely, in that now almost all of the water is being deflected and drained on the outside. Very little will get through at all. And if it is, it'll be able to drain down and out. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail because we're going to add a water control layer here so that almost basically no water will be absorbed anymore. So that is, again, made these bricks super dry. Now we don't have to worry about freeze thaw anymore. But if we add our insulation to the inside, we still have the same dynamic of water being absorbed as we did before. But what we've changed, which could be a problem, is our ability to dry. Well, our ability to dry inward is gone. We're not really able to do that anymore. And it wasn't a major factor anyways, but it is a factor that may come into play. Probably the bigger factor is that we're going to have slower drying to the outside now because our heat loss through the wall is so much less. So the heat can really help drive this process. And now we have much less heat loss than we did before. And so we're going to slow this drying process down, which means these bricks are going to be wetter for longer of the year than they used to be. Okay. And so that's the thing we're kind of worried about. The other thing we have to worry about potentially is that we don't have any air leakage condensation issues here. If interior air is able to get through this system that we've added to the inside and reach this cold brick, we could now start getting condensation on this side, and we're adding moisture from both sides, which could be a real problem. And we'll talk more about details on that as we get into the approaches that work section. So yeah, that leads well into this. Approaches that work. So these are ways we can do this that are going to work if we do them right, if we get the details right, and we'll talk more about details at the end. So on the exterior insulation side, there's pretty much two different approaches we could take. One is adding EIFS, or exterior insulated finish system, to the outside, also known as synthetic stucco. Basically the steps required for that are repair our damaged bricks and mortar, clean the exterior surface, install a liquid applied air water barrier, which is very common in the EIFS industry, and then add our drained EIFS system, which is basically foam board insulation and an acrylic coating to the outside. So this would be a really simple and effective way of adding insulation to the outside. This is almost a one contractor solution, other than the repair brick and mortar, right? This is make sure your bricks are okay, and then call your EIFS contractor, make sure their details look good, and do this.
It's interesting, Trevor. I've heard, I don't know this for sure, but I've heard anecdotally the EIFS was developed sort of post World War I or II to repair some of the war-torn buildings in Europe. And I don't know if that's true or not. So again, someone's going to have to go look that up. But it is interesting because it is such a beautiful, elegant solution. And yet when we brought it to North America, and I'm from North Carolina, we really screwed EIFS up and gave it a bad name. And again, it wasn't a bad product. We just screwed up the application. So
exactly,
it's
yeah, it does have it, and some people still associate it with those problems. And really, this is the ideal way to use EIFS, would be over a solid masonry backer wall like this. Would be
right,
so safe and so effective. So if the other approach we could take, which is probably more closely aligned with what I'm going to do with my wrecked brick, is more of an overcladding approach, which is really the same thing up until the very outside. So we're still going to want to repair our bricks and mortar if they're damaged. We're going to want to clean our exterior surface and install an air water barrier. The liquid applied is still probably the best approach, but we probably could get away with just a sheet applied air water barrier in this approach. Then we're going to add our insulation. The difference here being now we have to find a way to attach our insulation, right? This was the EIFS typically gets adhered on with glues. We'll have to figure out, how we're going to attach this, and then how we're going to support our cladding on the outside. Two different ways you could do it. One is with strapping, wood strapping, and use concrete screws through to the structure, which would work well in a residential for sure. More commercially though, we get into things like clip and rail systems, where we have steel members that aren't continuous, that do somewhat penetrate through the insulation, but are there to hold the cladding on and directly attach to our backup wall. In this case, our cladding, our brick, triple wide brick. In this case, though, you could use any kind of cladding. You can use funky modern steel cladding. You could use wood clapboard to make it look, like a house from that era. There's lots of options here. As long as you're talking about a lightweight cladding, you could use anything here. And this approach can work really well. Again, the exterior insulation approach is the safest approach. Benefits obviously are that the bricks stay warm and dry, so we don't have to worry about freeze thaw anymore. The embedded wood, which I'm going to talk a bit more about later, also stay warm and dry. And then all the work on this can be done from the exterior, which could be good if you want to not disturb the people living inside. Could be bad if you have a tall building and difficult access. So plus or minus on that from the exterior. The main drawback from this is that you've lost that historic facade. So you're not going to see that brick anymore. You're covering it up. There's probably some cost implications to this approach compared to the others. Depends on if you're already doing work on the interior or not. So it could cost more, but it might not. And again, it could be a drawback that the work is from the exterior, depending on the access to the building. If you need lifts and scaffolding or what have you, or if it's a nice bungalow, it would be a great, it wouldn't be a drawback at all, it'd be a benefit. But really, this all comes down to, I think, is are you willing to lose that historic facade on your building? If not, If you are, then this is a great approach, safe approach. If you're not, then we have to look at insulating from the inside. And that's a very different dynamic. A couple different ways. I'm going to look at two different approaches to insulating from the interior. The first is what I'm going to call the spray foam approach. By far the most common approach that my clients have been using. And I think you'll see why. I think it's just the simplest approach of interior insulation. So what are the steps required for this approach? The first would be an optional step of installing a bond breaker. So about a third of my clients do this, about 2/3 don't, is just apply some kind of sheet material against the brick so that the spray foam doesn't adhere directly to it. The reason why is it's really difficult to undo this after the fact if it needs to get redone later, to rip it out if it's directly on the brick. But a lot of my clients decide not to do that step and just go straight to the brick. Step two would be to install an interior stud wall with a 2-inch gap. Sometimes we cheat and use less, but I would recommend a 2-inch gap between the existing wall and the stud wall so that we can install a continuous layer of spray foam behind the studs to the brick wall. And so the great thing about this approach right now is that, okay, that spray foam we just applied, it's really all of our control layers in one, right? It's going to help us for water control. Any water that does get through to this layer is still going to drain down. It's not going to go through our spray foam. Obviously, it's our insulation, so it's our thermal control. And if installed properly, can act as a very good air control layer also. So that's really the reason why so many of my clients do this, is because you're getting that 3-for-1 with this spray foam. The contractors are available and ready to go. Then you can add bad insulation to the stud wall, which is good for sound. Some of my clients choose to just add more spray foam. But I typically recommend using a bad insulation here, which helps for sound attenuation. It's obviously more cost effective. And then really just the installed drywall or other interior finish. And if we have our insulation ratios right, we don't even need a separate vapor barrier in this case. The spray foam can act as our vapor barrier. If we've got at least about 1/3 of our insulation as spray foam, 2/3 of our R value in the wall, that will work really well in Southern Ontario. And that's similar clients.
And Trevor, sorry, on the spray foam, I might have missed you say it, but that typically would be like a closed cell.
Yeah, that's correct. That is closed cell. Yeah,
okay.
That is closed cell.
Yeah.
So that we get all those benefits of air tightness and of vapor control. Yeah.
So it's interesting. So the path there, because we get this question a lot. Well, do I got to put poly on the inside now? Someone told me I need to. Someone told me I can't, shouldn't. And you get the contractors caught in the middle. So it's interesting what you just said. So follow the building science. A good air barrier, good thermal layer. You have your air tightness. It is a vapor throttle, if you will, the closed cell. And if you follow sort of that inboard outboard ratio and don't put too much on the inside or have that balance, you've sort of taken care of the vapor control. So again, why need a vapor barrier or something like poly that's 30 times more impermeable than it needs to be, right? So
this in this assembly, the spray foam truly is a 4-for-1 approach, which is why I think it gets used so often. And it can, if installed in a quality manner, can really get the job done well. I do throw in step 6 as optional, which is install vapor barrier paint or primer on the drywall. And that would be if your building inspector just is giving you a hassle for not having an air barrier, or not having a vapor barrier. Or maybe if you're not confident in your ratio here, maybe if your ratio is like, I don't really quite have 1/3, maybe I only have 1/4 of my R value in the spray foam, and I got about 3/4 out here, then that vapor barrier paint or primer can just be enough to slow down your vapor flow and avoid any issues with vapor condensation.
What about a smart vapor retarder in there?
Yeah, that's definitely another way to go. And it's going to be 100% necessary in the next version or the next option.
Okay. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Nope. I would say in this one, you can avoid that special need for that special material because you use the spray foam.
Okay.
But in the next approach, it's going to be really important. So just real quick, benefits of this approach: readily available materials and trades, easy to transition in different areas, which we'll talk a bit more about. Drawbacks is going to be, yeah, we made those bricks colder and wetter than before, so we're worried about our freeze-thaw stuff. Same with embedded wood, it's going to be wetter than before. We're going to talk a bit more about that. And then we've just got generally some risks associated with spray foam. And I'm not going to get into those, but there's some people who just won't use spray foam. There's some people who are very cautious about it for various reasons. That mostly the fact that we are producing a building material on site and things can go wrong sometimes. But I won't get too much into that. That is a different discussion for a different day. So let's talk about the next approach. So the next one is also an interior insulation approach. It's what I call foam free. So this is for the people who don't want to use spray foam or other materials that are foam based. This is actually really popular in the world of passive house renovations, this approach. So let's talk about what do we have here. So what we've got now, or what we need here, is to install a water control layer against the brick. So we don't have that foam anymore to keep water out. We're going to need an actual water control layer, which is either going to have to be spray applied or a membrane, because we don't want any moisture from this brick to get into this insulation.
So like a dimple, Casella Dorkin.
Yeah, that could be a dimple sheet. It could even be as much something as like a Tyvek or a Typar potentially, but difficult to detail that. Definitely could be a dimple sheet. But what we don't want, because what the next layer is a continuous layer of semi-rigid mineral wool insulation. And so what we don't want is water, vapor, or liquid being driven into this, because we know that when mineral wool gets wet and stays wet for a while, it can give off some odors from the ingredients that have a fishy smell that we don't want. And I'm sure there's articles about that. So we don't want water interacting with it out in here where it could be trapped, right? Because we don't have a lot of ability to dry to the inside here. So after our layer of continuous semi-rigid mineral wool, we're going to install a stud wall, and we can fill that with bad insulation again, whether mineral wool or fiberglass, doesn't really matter. And then this is where we get to our smart vapor retarder / air barrier. So this layer that's on the outside of here has two functions. It's acting as a vapor retarder, but it also, because it's a smart vapor barrier, if moisture does get in here, it has some ability to allow drying to the inside. Okay. And it's run, but its more important function is as an air barrier. And this needs to be a very good air barrier to avoid air leakage condensation. So what we can't have is air leaking through or around this and getting into this cavity and reaching this cold surface here and creating condensation and adding moisture to this wall system. So this air barrier is really important. And that's why it's detailed like this, with strapping and to create a service channel on the outside, so we don't have wiring penetrating through before we put our drywall on. So this is it's a pretty common approach in New York City for some reason. And I think that's because of they have a strong presence of passive house consultants, and they like this approach. And there are people, I'll show you the next page, the workmanship that's required for this is high level. And it can be done, which is why it's an approach that works or can work. But one of the negatives we'll see is that it's less available materials and trades are required for this. So this is an example over here, and this is from images are from the website 475.ca, and they sell these materials and have actually good details on how to do this approach.
Yes.
But I don't know about you guys, but in the job sites I typically go to, I don't see this type of workmanship. This is custom high-end stuff that you need to be really careful from a quality control standpoint if you do this. Yeah. So the benefits of, there's no spray foam, no petrochemicals. Some of the transitions, certainly the wall to ceiling transition of the air barrier repair is really easy and good. All the work is from the interior, which could be good. Some of the drawbacks, obviously, is that we're going to make those bricks colder and wetter than they were before. We're going to make our embedded wood, if we have any, wetter than before. I'm going to talk more about that. It's really difficult to transition this to the foundation, and we're going to talk more about that. And there's a risk here of air leakage condensation. So this air barrier we see has to be really, really good. And if you're doing a passive house project and you're blower door testing this like 3 or 4 times throughout and trying to get it to, I think in retro it's under 1, I think, air change per hour.
Yeah, and we've
This
seen a
can
lot
work.
of use of like aero barrier and products like that just nail those last few holes, get them to their under 1 or the 0.6 or whatever they're trying to achieve, right? But like you said, it's more of that condensation, because you reminded us last time in that hierarchy, rainwater, exterior rainwater is the '1 wetting mechanism of a building. Only second to that, but second place is air leakage.
Yeah, in cold climates, air leakage condensation is right there. Yeah. So we have to make sure, if we use an approach like this, that we're doing multiple air tests and that this is reaching high levels of air tightness, which is a good idea anyways.
Yeah, that's right.
Because all of the insulation used in this system is air permeable. So anything that gets past that air barrier can go through and find that cold interior brick wall and create problems. So that's the proof there. So I wanted to do real quick. How are we doing on time? We're a little tight.
Another 15 minutes.
Okay, let's go through this quick.
Yeah.
So this is, if anyone's ever seen this before, this is the moisture balance. And this is from Straub and Burnett's textbook. This is a classic. The black and white part is the original diagram, and the blue is what I've added to talk about what we're talking about today. So basically what the moisture balance is that every material in a building has some type of safe storage capacity. So it can hold a certain amount of moisture safely without being damaged. And we also have wetting mechanisms, things that are adding moisture to our walls and ways that the moisture is drying. And as long as we're drying fast enough or wetting slow enough that we don't bring this level too high to tip the balance, then we don't have a problem. But as soon as this balance tips over, we have a problem. And so there's a couple of different things you can do to help this balance stay in this position, never get tipped over. One would be to add safe storage capacity, put a bigger weight down here. But in our case, when we're talking about brick that's existing, a brick wall that's there's not much we can do about its safe storage capacity. So that's kind of can't change that. So what we have to deal with is reducing wetting and not hurting drying as much as possible, allowing as much drying as possible. So these are all the different wetting mechanisms that are possible and things that we can affect. We'll talk a bit about each of them. And we've got to think about this drying. We've already slowed the heat flow down by adding insulation. We can't really do anything about that. Hopefully vapor permeability shouldn't be a problem in our interior insulation approaches. There's not much, to be honest, we can do about drying if we're using an interior insulation approach.
Right.
So that really leaves us with reduce our wetting as much as possible. And that's what we'll talk a bit more about. So assuming we're going to go with an interior insulation approach, there's a few things we can do to make sure we're minimizing how much water even gets into this wall. The first one is repointing. Repointing is replacing the outer layers of mortar on the building. So as the mortar is actually supposed to act as a sacrificial layer, and it should be the first thing that breaks down as opposed to the bricks. But as they break down and start to become sub-flush, that's just more area, surface area for water to get into the building. So we want to make sure that we keep our mortar pointed properly to minimize moisture that's getting into our walls. But it's also important that we use the right mortar for the bricks we're using. So mortars basically has to be softer and more vapor permeable than the bricks around it. We're not going to measure the bricks strength and vapor permeability, but we do have some pretty good guidelines on how to approach this. Basically, we want to use mortar types that have less cement in them, less Portland and more lime.
More
So there's
lime.
more
Yeah.
lime as opposed to Portland. And so there's basically all these types of mortar. I won't get into them, but basically, as we move this way from M to L, we're talking about less Portland, it's becoming less Portland cement and more lime as we go. L is 100% lime, no Portland cement. And these are kind of mixes in between. We're also getting going from very hard mortar to softer mortar here. And it's the same with vapor permeability, from less vapor permeable to more vapor permeable. And as a general rule of thumb, N, K, and O are really the ones here that should be used in most historic retrofits to try and match, the mortar that was in the building in the first place and to match the old brick. And I don't have much more detail than that, other than to realize that you can't just say, call a mason and say, come repoint my building, because he'll probably do it with type M mortar. And that's what
we have seen this, where if the mortar is stronger than the stone or the brick, it will structurally tear the stone or the brick apart. Like it's interesting. They had some similar issues to this actually happen on one of the large cathedrals in Guelph, Our Lady Church. I remember they had to bring in, I think his name is Paul Jeffs, to work on that project, because the original work that had been done, some of these things hadn't been taken into account.
Okay. So beware of this. I'm not an expert on mortar types, but I know that we shouldn't be using the ones at this end for a historic building. And we need to work in this range and talk to people who know more about the, and I think finding the right mason would be important, and kind of double checking that they know what they're doing. Yeah.
And back to the carbon, Trevor.
Yeah.
The cement industry is looking at that lime again, because it offsets that high embodied carbon content that's in Portland.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
So we may be going back. Yeah. We may be sort of working our way back to the olden days in that way, which is interesting. So the other thing for reduced wetting, the obvious one is like, make sure your roof details are taken care of. Kick out flashings, diverters, eaves, troughs, and downspouts are sealed. Downspouts kick water away from the foundation. All those important things that keep water from cascading down and having concentrations on our walls. We want to make sure that's number one, really, after getting our brick repointed, is just make sure the roof details are done properly. Nothing special, just proper. And anything that's broken down over the years gets fixed before we do this interior insulation, because the less water that those bricks see, the better chance they have of surviving. Another one detail is windows. So one thing that we've noticed is that we see a lot of issues below windows, and that's because windows collect water and can put a concentration of water to the areas below the window. This is the window of my house. You can see the saw cut here that works pretty good. It is wet below here because I kind of had to throw a bucket of water on here to get this picture, but it generally does a pretty good job.
Yeah.
And this curve. Yeah, this kerf cut it does a pretty good job of creating a drip as opposed to letting the water come back to the wall. My neighbor's house, this is literally on the other side of my driveway, was detailed just like this, except this one was parged over for some reason. And the kerf was parged over, and you can see the concentration of water here. And this isn't an area where we see a lot of driving rain, but I thought it was a great example of the fact that you're starting to see this damage because they got rid of that saw. This is actually a really common sort of retrofit approach, is to add a metal drip edge can work well, but beware of this problem, which is it's not on a 45 and it's hemmed. And we've seen this experimentally. Water will literally shoot back very quickly to the wall in this type of a drip edge. If it's not kicked out at a 45 and or it doesn't have a sharp edge to drop it off. Which is why I added this little note here. If you are really interested in drip edges and want to geek out, this is a link to a study that I did with Jonathan Smeagol back in the day on drip edges and got picked up by Construction Canada.
Nice.
Yeah. So let's make sure our windows are detailed properly that way. Then we have to deal with rising damp. This is a little more complicated, right? So if we have a brick or a rubble foundation with bricks sitting right on it, there's going to be a lot of capillary wicking of moisture up here. So what can we do about that? The first thing we need to do about it, the easiest and most obvious, is take care of our exterior drainage and landscaping. Let's make sure that we have proper slope. If we can, let's dig this down and put proper drainage mat and proper footing drains in. A lot of times we can't do that. And so we have to deal with some other issues. The other thing I've seen, this is pretty extreme, but if this is going to be a real problem, is to put stainless steel shims basically between the foundation and the brick. It's not easy to do and it's expensive, but if it means that the brick can survive versus not survive, I've seen this done. The other thing that's more recently been done and is probably more practical now is something called dry rot damp proofing. And I put damp proofing in quotes because it's not really damp proofing. It's more like capillary blocking. And so what this is a material rod that you can put in at regular intervals into your foundation at the mortar joints. And when it gets wet, it dissolves some of the material which will follow the pathways of the capillary action, and it crystallizes inside the capillaries.
Is this the same thing as the crystalline concrete?
It is the same technique. It's the same technology.
Okay.
Yes,
It's like pozzolin that goes in and it basically fills the pore structures.
right.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we had a job that we worked on similar to that. They did have drainage mat on the outside, but what we found was that due to the water levels, the footing was just sitting in water all the time, and we couldn't stop the rising damp by just using an exterior drainage mat. So we had to use this approach.
Yeah.
So pretty extreme, but if that rising damp is going to be a problem, these are some options you've got.
Yeah.
The next would be surface coatings. So I just put this right up front. Painting brick has a big no on it. Don't paint the brick. Now, this is specifically related to load bearing, triple wide, double wide brick walls. If this is a brick cladding with an airspace behind, it's still not a great idea, but it's not that bad. But certainly for load bearing brick, paint is not going to help us in any way. It's going to dramatically reduce our vapor flow drying. It'll keep the water out for like a very short period of time, but that outward vapor flow that naturally is going to occur is going to destroy the paint really quickly. Water's still going to get in, and you're going to have this mottled mess in a couple of years. And it's going to accelerate the freeze-thaw damage because moisture is going to get trapped behind the paint, and you'll just get freeze-thaw happening behind the paint. So that's a big no-no. There are more advanced coatings, silenes and siloxanes, I think they're called. Yeah, siloxanes, which do have, again, that similar crystalline technology to them. But it's not as clear cut as just put them on and it's going to help reduce absorption, because it is going to help reduce absorption of the brick of water through the face of the brick. But a couple problems. One is that it's not going to help with any cracks in the mortar that occur over time, which is very common, right? So once you put it on, it might work for the first year, but as things shift, micro cracks occur, and a lot of water can be pulled through micro cracks at the mortar joints. It's not going to help you there. And it is, even though they say they are vapor open, they are still significantly more vapor closed than the brick itself.
Okay, so
And so
you're,
this was a cool little piece of research I found, which basically said for these types of silanes and siloxanes, these penetrating sealers for concrete and brick, if you reduce the absorption by 70%, for example, you also reduce the vapor transmission by almost the exact same 70%.
oh, yeah, that's pretty
So
significant.
remember our moisture balance, right? So we
Yeah.
did take away some of the water that was getting in, but we've also taken away its ability to dry. And we're not sure in the long term how effective it is about reducing its wetting because of the micro cracks and things that occur over time that coating's not going to cover.
Yeah, interesting.
So it can be done, and but it's not a home run solution. It might help, it might not. And there's a lot of other factors that come into play. So we generally don't recommend this approach as saying, well, all we'll do is put a sealer on it and we'll be fine.
Yeah.
Way more important to do the other parts of the water control that we talked about.
It's interesting. I've seen a lot of those crystalline. I think there was a product called Zypex that's often used in the bottom of elevator shafts, but it's on the interior, right? On concrete. It's unseen. It's on the inside. And then you try to take it and put it on the outside. And it's a hold on a minute, different drying profile.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And when the material cracks, that, you know, those cracks can pull in a lot of water, and now we've reduced ability to dry. So that's the potential issue there. Okay, so now I'm going to go through a couple of what I call critical details, things that we can do to help these things work better, right? So if we're using an exterior insulation approach, our bricks are dry and warm, our wood, right? A lot of times we've got wood embedded in, wood floor joists embedded in. They're going to be warm and dry too. We don't have to do anything. But if we're using our interior insulation approach, either one, we may have issues here because now the penetrating wood floor joists are on the cold side and wet side of this assembly, at least the ends of them are. You can still get some drying capillary wise through, but no doubt the ends of these joists are going to be wetter and drier than they used to be. And if that is a major concern for us, there is an option we can use. It's very similar to what I talked about dry rods. These are called borate rods. Very similar approach. You drill a hole, you put one of these borate rods in, and it's basically the pressure treated chemical that we use typically is borate based. And if they do get wet, they dissolve the borates, they fill the pore structure of the wood and give it a resistance to rot.
interesting.
So that's an option we have. I typically don't worry as much about if it's just the end of a joist, because there is quite a bit of drying potential inward. But certainly if there's a joist that's running the other way and gets completely encapsulated, that would be really important if it's getting completely encapsulated.
Right. Yeah.
So borate rods are an option to help protect that wood that's now on the cold wet side. Next critical detail is that wall to foundation detail. How do we make sure that our air barrier and our water control is properly transitioned from our walls to our foundations? If we're using an exterior insulated approach, we're adding a new water control layer behind there. And all we have to do is make sure that it bridges down onto our foundation. Okay, so we just don't want it to stop here. We need this to act as air and water control across this joint, which is typically very susceptible to air leakage, right? The rim joist area. So as long as we can properly transition to the foundation with that, we should be good. If we're using our interior spray foam approach, we could potentially just use spray foam in the basement, spray foam between the floor joists to get our air tightness. And that'll help air control, transition the air control layer from the wall above to the foundation below. We're still, ideally, we'd cut back the subfloor so we can get right through there, ideally. It's not a big deal, but it's quite a bit trickier when it comes to our foam-free interior insulation, right? Because now we have this smart vapor retarder / air barrier, and it's way out here. And if we're trying to transition that back even to an insulated foundation, we've got to go through the floor system somehow with this. And it's a lot trickier, right? If it's self-adhered, maybe we can self-adhere that to the subfloor and then self-adhere this to the subfloor and use that as a transition. But we have to cut this to go around every floor joist. So it's going to be really tough to get proper air tightness at the rim joist area in this approach without spray foam.
Right.
It's going to take a lot of detailing. It's going to take someone in there putting tape around each floor joist. I've done it myself before. It's possible, but
Yeah.
In reality, it's pretty tough to get contractors to do that and do that
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
So
And the
that's
other thing too, I'll just a reminder, and you mentioned it already, but again, one thing we often see missed, because sometimes this is, sort of do it yourselfers or one contractor does one thing and another, is as soon as you move from your outside insulation to the interior ones, you have to disengage that foundation from the exterior ground. Drain it, but disengage it. Don't leave the dirt against that foundation. You get into ad freezing action, all sorts of nasty things happen. And
yeah, great point. So the other critical detail is the wall to roof detail. And so it's actually, if on the exterior insulated approach, it actually gets a little trickier than most, because we've got to try and get our new air barrier, which is out here, somehow connected to our roof air barrier. If we have a flat ceiling and we're using poly, that's way over here, which is pretty tough. So we'd have to use, I think, spray foam across the top of the wall to make that transition. Maybe though, we're going to do continue our insulation on the underside of the roof deck and have some living space up here. A lot of older houses do have that approach. And if so, it makes sense. We can use spray foam to come down the roof and transition down onto the top of that wall. This could work a lot better, but a little bit tricky because we've got to get from here to here potentially and get a nice airtight seal. And I think only really spray foam could do that as far as I can tell. Yeah. If we're using an interior approach with spray foam, it's a bit easier because now our air barrier is here. If we're using poly and a blown in insulation approach, it's pretty easy to get that seal pretty well done here. And if we're going to use, again, that same insulate the underside of the roof deck approach, everything lines up pretty well. It'd be pretty easy to do. And similarly with the interior foam-free approach, it's pretty easy to make this transition from our smart vapor retarder / air barrier to a ceiling level poly. And if we're not going to use spray foam, then we're probably not doing anything on the underside of the deck, hopefully, because that would be, again, another level of risk to start insulating the underside of a roof deck with blown in insulation or other air permeable insulation. So that should work pretty well on that approach, though, as long as we're doing blown in, above the ceiling level.
So we're at your 10-minute mark.
Okay, cool. Let's just do windows. Windows real quick. So a couple things with the exterior insulation approach, we still have to be careful with where our windows are. If we don't move our windows or we don't do something different, we just keep them where they are and don't do anything. We have quite a thermal bridge here because we've got cold brick exposed to, or we have brick exposed to outdoor temperatures and can come right in. We can lose heat this way. So we either have to push our windows to the outside to meet and line up with our new exterior insulation level, or we need to do some kind of insulated buck here so that we can we get rid of that thermal bridge, which will you see quite a bit of heat loss, and putting good windows in this manner, you'll get very poor results overall.
Right.
Because of the flanking heat loss we'll see there. So that's for exterior insulated. For interior insulated, we have the same problem, really. If we don't move our windows, we still have this thermal bridge because we've got our windows pushed out beyond in this case, beyond our thermal barrier. So we either have to do an insulated buck to keep them where they are, to keep those windows where they are. So we'll have to take them out, probably put smaller windows in.
Yeah.
So we have room for this insulation so that we can have this insulated buck, or we have to pull our windows way in to the insulation level, or to the level of the insulation, which means we've got all this exposed brick, which we never used to have, which we'll have to deal with exterior trims, and that there could be some funky water control.
Needing to slope it and.
Yeah, it gets difficult here. I think this is the most realistic approach for that.
Okay.
So I'm kind of going through those quick just in case. Oh yeah, okay, cool. So in summary, exterior insulation is really the easiest way to go in that it keeps the bricks and embedded wood warm and dry. It's super safe. It's easy to do, but we lose the historic look and feel of our building on the outside. Interior insulation retrofits are going to make the bricks wetter and colder and increase the risk of future freeze-thaw damage. So we need to do something about that. We need to figure out how freeze-thaw vulnerable our bricks are. We need to reduce wetting as much as possible in the different ways we talked about. And no matter which way we choose to go, we have to get the details right. We have to make sure our water control layer is continuous and detailed properly, and our air control, especially those two. And then obviously the thermal control. The reason we're doing this is try and save energy. So we want to make sure we avoid those thermal bridges and make sure our thermal control layer is continuous. And vapor control is still in the mix, but it's not really a major issue with either of these. I think we kind of understand how to do that.
Yeah.
And
awesome.
Now slightly over time, but we did leave almost 10 minutes for questions.
Hey, that's great, Trevor. No, when we've got 4 questions,
Okay.
and that's good. We've had some comments too over in the side, which are nice. Just some references of, some prefab EIFS systems in the ICI industry that you could bring to the residential, which are sort of cool. There were some questions about window detailing from Nicola, which you just answered. But I'll tell you what, we're going to take these 4 questions and rapid round. We got 5 minutes. So here you go. First, we got 3. So here's the first one. These are from David. So he's heard that you can pressurize the interior cavity of the masonry to encourage airflow to the exterior. Any experience with that?
No experience with that. I know it's been done. The only way it makes sense is in something like a museum, something that has a very high budget and has high levels of interior RH that you're worried about beyond just residential. Like if you have to keep 50% interior RH and you don't want to use a spray foam approach, then you may have to pressurize the cavity so that you don't get air leakage and air leakage condensation in that cavity. But very rare circumstances where you'd ever have to do that. Only on a very high-end building that has very high interior humidity.
Good. David threw a question in. Can you comment, for instance, on woofy? There you go. Knew that was coming. Analysis to determine the ideal amount of interior insulation for the benefit of masonry's durability.
Right. So when I talked about in the lab where we measured the critical saturation level of these bricks, the reason we did that is so we could feed the information into woofy and do models. And that one thing I can't generalize much in this industry, but what thing I can say is that once you put probably an inch of spray foam on the inside, you might as well put 2 or 3, because the changes you've made to the dynamics of the wall, and Woofy will bear this out for us, is that once you put 1 inch, the changes you've made don't get any worse when you add 2 or 3 inches or 4 inches for that matter of spray foam.
Okay.
But it is also possible if you have the actual material properties of the brick to do woofy modeling and determine how the different approaches will affect freeze-thaw risk.
So you'd have to have good information on the existing product, in this case, the brick, the type of brick, that type of thing.
And it costs, like realistically, it'll cost about $8,000 to $10,000 to test the brick, $4,000 to $5,000 to do the woofy to come up with the right answers for that. So it's a $15,000 to $20,000 project to do that.
There you go.
There's people who do it. RDH still does it, and Randy Van Straten at Belly do that work.
Cool. And they've got your contact information. You can connect them with all those folks. That's good.
Absolutely.
All right. The Ian asked, he says there's a contractor or whatever in the GTA that uses a cementitious foam injection into the space between the courses in a double brick wall. Any experience with that? Or
no, not much. Most of our brick walls don't have a space that you could really do that to. Some do.
Okay.
I know that it would have essentially the same effect on the outer layer of brick that we're talking about, in it being wetter and colder than before.
Okay.
So you still have to worry about all it. I guess from a building science perspective, it would be similar to the spray foam interior approach in terms of the things you have to worry about from a building science perspective.
Okay.
But I don't have experience firsthand with that approach.
Yeah. David says, any experience with thin set brick or stone for exterior cladding?
Yeah, I mean, it can work really well. It's if you have a drained airspace behind it, it can work really well. The one thing I do know about adhered brick and stone is if you put it directly adhere it to a wood framed wall without an airspace and drainage space, that you can get out inward vapor drive that can quickly rot out OSB or the framing. So you really want that capillary break between that layer and the wood framing.
I think we call it lick and stick stone, right? It goes, it adheres. Yeah, that's excellent.
Well, if you're doing it directly onto an old brick wall, you wouldn't have to worry about that as much because you've got that.
I see.
Yeah, that moisture buffer there.
Okay. Brett says, is there an association you're aware of for masons that are familiar or certified to work with historical buildings?
Not that I know of. I'm sure it exists.
Yeah.
But yeah, not that I know of. I typically work closely with architects and engineers, and I don't often work directly with the masons to fully understand, their side of the business.
I would, Brent, maybe what I'll do is I'll invite people over in the chat. If anybody does know of a mason that is skilled at historical, again, matching those softer mortars, using historic stone, all that type of stuff, because I think it's an important question. Feel free to put that over there. If anybody knows of any of those contacts, feel free to send me an email to it, andy@buildinghouse.ca, because there is an individual, and I cannot recall their name, but they work on this type of thing. I just can't bring it to mind. David McCauley says, Trevor, what effects do, number one, orientation, south facing versus north, 2, wind, 3, the landscaping and the vines on exterior walls?
Yeah. So when we model, when we were doing this woofy modeling, we would always model it in 2 ways. On the south face, sorry, let me start again. On the north side, because it gets the least amount of sun to dry out brick, and we also run it on whatever face the driving rain was coming from, which was usually west, right? Yeah, west.
Yeah.
No, sorry, northeast was typically
East.
in a lot of Ontario, northeast is like the coldest and wettest side of a building, and it does affect the modeling, but we always did worst case scenario, so we would do that orientation, so you're getting the wettest, coldest orientation possible. As far as the effects of vines, I always, from a building science perspective, say take the vines off. No one ever listens to me, but because it doesn't really help with the moisture getting in, but it does slow down, it shades and slows down drying. So there's a bit of a risk there.
So you're that guy that says it has to come off the wall.
I'm that guy. I'm like,
Yeah. David just shared a gentleman named Doug Burpee does particularly stone masonry restoration. So that's again, that's really helpful. So thanks, David, for that. Trevor, you are like bang on. That was awesome. So I'm going to thanks to you. That is great. I feel like there's a lot of other areas too, like even the below grade stuff seems, on restoration could almost be another, but man, you covered a lot of territory even to that point. So thank you so much, folks. Thank you as
pleasure.
well. I'm going to just share my screen here. We have coming up here, just hold tight.
Oh, I see. I think I have to
Things
go.
in order. So we do have just real quick our building science digest. We have one that's going to be coming out soon. It's got articles and all these folks. It's got references, webinar, all these types of things on it. So keep your eye out for that, or sign up for it. Actually, I guess is the big one. The next presentation we have is actually before the end of the year. We do have December 15th. We're going to jump from passive elements in building science and active, and we're going to have Will Beardmore from Blue Water Energy join us. And Will has worked on probably more net zero projects in Canada than any other contractor, with net zero builders, net zero ready builders. He's very close to the solar industry, the energy storage energy, and the utilities and everyone involved. And there are some real challenges, and Will's simply going to put it out there. We've got challenges with ESA, we've got challenging with CSA, and yet we have consumers and builders that want to do more solar, and yet we keep running into these roadblocks. And we're going to talk about what is happening in actuality. Why is it actually getting harder to do some of these things? So thank you, folks. Trevor, thanks again. And have a good Thursday afternoon, folks.
Take care, everyone. Thanks for coming out.